What makes William Maxwell one of our great American writers? A.O. Scott will be here to talk about his latest essay in our series, The Americans. How does the necessity of morally compromised labor implicate us all? A.L. Press will be here to talk about his new book, Dirty Work. Alexandra Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, our critics will talk to us about what they're reviewing. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's August 27th. I'm Pamela Paul. A.O. Scott joins us now from Maine to talk about the latest in his series, The Americans. The subject this time around is William Maxwell. Tony, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Pamela.
Who is William Maxwell?
William Maxwell may be best known in some ways for his day job, not for his writing. He was a fiction editor at The New Yorker for many decades. And in a way, even if he had never published anything under his own name, he would have been an influential figure in American writing. He edited John Updike, Mary McCarthy, J.D. Salinger, many of the luminaries of The New Yorker in its mid-century glory years. But he was also a novelist. He published 5 novels and many volumes of many short stories in his long career that started in the mid-30s and went up almost to his death in 2000. And one of the things that I was trying to do in writing this piece is figure out and explain to myself and also to interested readers what kind of writer he was, because he eludes easy categorization, I think. He writes a lot about a small-town Midwestern life in the early part of the 20th century, but he's not really a historical novelist. He's not really a regional realist, I don't think. He was associated for many years with The New Yorker, but he doesn't quite fit as a writer the stamp of what we think of as a New Yorker writer. So he is, however, one of my very favorite writers. I'll say that. I mean, he's a writer who it is a perpetual pleasure to discover and rediscover.
Did he think of himself primarily as a writer or as an editor?
He did, yeah. And he published his first 2 novels, I believe. The first novel was Right Center of Heaven, which he was kind of unhappy with and which wasn't reprinted until the Library of America posthumous volumes that came out in 2008. But he published his first novels in the 30s and was very ambitious in that way and got recruited by Harold Roth, the first editor of The New Yorker, to work at The New Yorker. And he kind of went back and forth and sort of settled in permanently after the war when he had started a family and needed a steady job. But he always had an arrangement where he had a day off from going to the office at The New Yorker to write. And he continued to publish fiction throughout his career. And I think especially later on, he had a big success kind of late in life with a novel called So Long, See You Tomorrow, almost a novella, again, revisiting his childhood in this small town in Illinois in the early part of the 20th century. This time a little more overtly autobiographical, with the town given its right name and many of the characters and members of his family given their names. And that brought him a lot of recognition and I think sparked the first rediscovery of his work, which is when I first read him was when I was in college in the late 80s. And a lot of the earlier books, starting with Time Will Darken It and also The Folded Leaf, his 3rd and 4th novels. I said them in the wrong order. His 4th and 3rd novels. Those came out and those were the first things I read. And they just had an enormous effect on me, especially Time Will Darken It, which I think is really his masterpiece and is the one that I spend the most time on, I think, in this piece, which is just an incredibly vivid and subtle and sometimes very funny, but also ultimately heartbreaking story of a family and its extended kin and friends and neighbors and this whole town in 1912 in rural Illinois. I read that book in college and it was just really one of the great reading experiences of my life. I think partly because my own father is from a similar town, obviously of a different generation, and in Western Ohio. And there was something about the world that he talked about, that my father used to talk about, of his childhood and his parents and grandparents, that I felt like Maxwell had just opened up and made real.
Despite working at a magazine with the name The New Yorker, was William Maxwell fundamentally a Midwestern writer?
That was a puzzle for me. There was a section that never made it into the piece because I just kind of tied myself in knots trying to answer that question and trying, first of all, to figure out what a Midwestern writer might be. And it turns out that that's a very hard question just in terms of literary identity. Is the Midwest a literary region? Because I started thinking about who would count as a Midwestern writer. Would F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's from Minnesota? Would Ernest Hemingway, who's from Illinois? Toni Morrison, who's from Ohio? David Foster Wallace? Theodore Dreiser, you kind of end up
I'm like
drawing
quietly saying yes and no in my head to different ones.
Right. But why or why not? I think there is something of a kind of New Yorker personality about him, both the magazine and the city as it was, let's say in the 40s and 50s, a kind of cosmopolitanism that rests very lightly, that's not aggressive about its own sophistication, but a kind of worldliness that I associate with the New Yorker. But at the same time, you could also associate it with the Midwest in the decades that he writes about, because the people in his stories, especially the people who are based on members of his own family, are very worldly, very aware of what's going on, very sophisticated in their judgments and their tastes and their intellectual ambitions. So I think he was, in a way, an exiled Midwesterner. I mean, I think he lived almost all of his adult life in and around New York. He wrote a wonderful, very funny novel called The Chateau about a trip to France, and a kind of classic variation on the Americans abroad theme. But his imagination always drew him back to Illinois, to Lincoln, to his own family, to his own life, but also to the particular civilization and culture and society that he knew growing up. And it was almost like in so many of these books, whether it's So Long, See You Tomorrow, or Time Will Darken It, or They Came Like Swallows, or the late short story collection, Billy Dyer, he's always trying to figure out what was that world. Not necessarily in a romantic historical fiction kind of way, but in a way that he was trying, in a sense, to figure out himself by figuring out where he had come from. And it was inexhaustible. The thing that's really remarkable about his revisiting his family story, and just the town where he lived is just how many layers are there, how much in, what seems like a simple, small provincial place, just how much depth and complexity and comedy and pathos live there.
It's interesting that it never feels like historical fiction. I mean, maybe They Came Like Swallows because, of course, we all know about that 1918 flu. But in the story itself, it's so personal and the focus is so tight that somehow it never feels like that's his goal.
Yeah, no, it never feels like he's dressing people up in costumes or putting on a pageant. And I think it's partly because his methods are very modern. He started out very much under the influence of Virginia Woolf and tried in a way to write his first novel, Right Center of Heaven, after Mrs. Dalloway. But what that means is that he's very attuned to the consciousness of his characters. And his people are always modern. They might live now more than a century distant from us and a half century distant from when he might be writing. But because we're in their heads and understanding their motives and their reactions and their relationships with each other, they can't seem anything but modern to us. They can't seem anything but immediate and recognizable, even when they're doing things that are irrational or strange. You just feel like you're there. That distance, that pictorial, historic distance that you get in a lot of historical fiction just vanishes.
And of course, there's that moment in So Long, See You Tomorrow where he actually goes in the head of a dog.
Yes. Yes.
What do you make of that? Is that an anomaly?
It's not the only time that he goes into the head of an animal. There are a few short stories, but in a way, he has this method that all consciousnesses are open to him. And it's a wonderful style. And it's a kind that's not used, I think, very much anymore. I mean, we have sort of an idea. It's common in a lot of current fiction to have serial narrators or spend a chapter from the perspective of this person, this person, this person. But he just sort of floats through everyone's minds just very freely. And he loves writing from the perspective of children. One of the most vivid characters in Time Will Darken It is a 4-year-old girl, Abigail King, who just sort of is absorbing all of the things that the grownups are doing and not understanding it. So a child, a dog, anybody who might have an interesting point of view on what's happening, who might have a perspective that could illuminate all of the strange behaviors of human beings that are his subjects, that's fair game for him. And the dog in So Long, See You Tomorrow is a very important character in a way, because it's the stories about this crime. It's almost a true crime story about.
It is a true crime story, isn't it?
Yeah,
right?
It is. It's about a murder that happened in his hometown when he was a kid that involved the parents of a friend of his. And there's an interesting kind of class dimension to the friendship. It's this kid who lives out, who's the son of tenant farmers who lives out of town, and Maxwell and his family live among the sort of the more bourgeois citizens of the town in the town proper. But the dog is the most loyal, and in a way the dog is the hero of the story, because everyone else is lying, is betraying, is selfishly pursuing their own ends, and the dog, in her absolute loyalty and devotion to this boy who loses everything, who loses all his friends, who loses his family because of what happens that has nothing to do with him and is no fault of his. The dog's adoration for him is a very important presence and reminder, in a way, that goodness and loyalty are possible even in this fallen world.
I don't understand anyone who could listen to you talk about this particular book right now and not want to read it. In my case, I want to reread it right now. But So Long, See You Tomorrow and They Came Like Swallows are probably the two of his best known books. You mentioned earlier that Time Will Darken It is your favorite. Which other book in particular would you recommend, or story?
I think his third novel, The Folded Leaf, is a really extraordinary book, and was, I think, the second thing of his that I read. I mean, it's about the friendship. It's a love story about two boys growing up in Chicago and then going to college at an unnamed university that's probably the University of Illinois. It was published in the 40s, in 1945, I think. And it reminds me a lot of E.M. Forster's Morris, which is a story about love between two young men that Forster suppressed in his lifetime and would only allow to be published posthumously. It's very candid about the sexual and emotional and romantic dimensions of this relationship in a way that is startling when you think about when it was written, but is also still startling because it's just not what you would expect somehow. It's so tender and also so comical and awful. The two boys, one of them is, I think, a recognizable Maxwell surrogate. If you read a lot of his fiction, there's a sort of always a kind of sensitive, unathletic, shy, dreamy, intellectual kid, sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, who's almost always him. And that character also has lost his mother and is living with his father in Chicago. His name is Limey. And he meets this kid named Spud.
What happened to that name?
Right? But Spud and Limey, and so Spud is outgoing. He's not particularly academically inclined. He's very athletic. He loves to fight. He just goes around getting in fights with kids. And he develops this very tender, protective interest in Limey. And Limey is absolutely devoted to him and adores him. And they spend all their time together. Spud's family kind of is aware of it, and that Limey is always sleeping over. They go to college. They move into a boarding house. They share a bed throughout most of their college time. We have a way of looking at it now. We would say, well, this is a great queer love story. And it is. But it also has these other dimensions that are particular to its own time and to the understanding that the characters and the people around them might have of what was going on. I think it's an amazing, that is a book that I reread it for this piece and then immediately read it again and just felt like there's so much in it. It's also such a lovely, simple, and characteristically for Maxwell, sort of tragicomic story. Terrible things happen, but it's also extremely funny and very wry about how people act and how people delude themselves about how they're acting and why.
He had a really long career as a writer. The first Library of America collection is from 1938 to 1956, and the second is from 1957 to 99. So first of all, is this division into early novels and stories and later novels and stories that the LOA makes in the publication of these two books arbitrary, or was there a stylistic change or evolution during that period that's clear and discernible?
I think it comes later. I don't think it comes in between the two volumes. Obviously, it helps to make the books more or less the same size. I think the change comes really much later, around in the 70s, and then in 1980 with the publication of So Long, See You Tomorrow. And what happens basically is the dropping or discarding of some of the masks of fiction. So Long, See You Tomorrow, he is the main character and narrator, and the town is, Lincoln. It's not called Draperville as it is in Time Will Darken It. And that goes even further in Billy Dyer, which is a collection of stories almost entirely about people in that town and about members of his own family that feel, however embellished or fictionalized they might be, that have a stamp of reality, of being the kind of literal remembered truth. And he also wrote around that time a memoir called Ancestors. So one thing that separates late from early is dispensing with some of the machinery of fiction and moving toward a more directly autobiographical, directly truthful kind of writing, whether he categorizes it as a novel or memoir.
I mean, you say he might be the unacknowledged forerunner of autofiction.
Yeah, that was something that occurred to me when I was reading some of the later books, because they feel so uninflected in a way. It's like, well, this was me, and I had this conversation, with my father, and I remembered this about my brother, and here's a story about my aunt, all in a very low key, so that, as is often the case with autofiction, that the stronger emotional currents are latent. As you're reading the story, you feel like you're reading a kind of almost anecdotal account of something, and it's only afterwards or only cumulatively that you get a sense of the power of it.
I started this conversation, Tony, thinking that I was not going to bring either of these books with me on vacation next week. Then I got to a place where I was like, well, it'll be this one or it'll be that one. And now I feel like I have to lug like 2 hardcover Library of America books with me. Tony, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you, Pamela.
A.O. Scott is writing a series of essays for the book review called The Americans. The latest one is William Maxwell. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So in the past, I've brought you a few op-eds that the book review ran over the years and talked about the fact that we did, in fact, run op-eds at the very beginning. And I'm going to bring you one from 1900 today, and the headline is Heroines Who Smoke. What the American heroine will do next to make herself profoundly disagreeable has become a vexed question. She has nearly boxed the compass already. And even England, home of the gentle maiden, whose girls are uniformly well-bred, has of late issued all sorts of fiends who use bad language and shock one's sensibilities. There follows examples of such disagreeable young women, but the op-ed writer, in this case a woman, and Mrs. Sherwood, has a conclusion, and she says, however, I will forgive the new heroine her cigarette and almost any degree of bad manners if she will only be grammatical and pleasing. I will forgive her, in fiction at least, a most unbecoming slangy speech, even to her mother or her friend, but not to her lover.
Well, this op-ed writer would be very, very disappointed in literature today.
That's exactly what I think.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
A.L. Press joins us now from the Berkshires. His new book is called Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. A.L., thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to start with a really basic question, which is, what is dirty work? It sounds like we should know what this is. How do you define dirty work?
The colloquial expression dirty work tends to refer to just an unpleasant task. I define it a little bit differently in this book. Dirty work, as I'm using the term in the book, is work that is morally troubling, but that much of society tacitly condones and doesn't want to hear too much about. So if we think about the targeted killings that drone operators carry out, or what goes on the kill floors of industrial slaughterhouses, it's work that is performing functions that are pretty integral to the way we live and to our society, but that tend to be hidden from view and that make us uncomfortable. And I wanted to get into the experiences and the dilemmas of the people who do this work, and also tell a larger story about how society organizes this work and delegates it.
This is your third book, and I can't help but think that this must have been connected in some way to your second book, maybe grew out of it or sort of a counterpoint. Correct me if I'm wrong. The previous book was called Beautiful Souls, The Courage and Conscience of Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Pamela. In fact, all three of my books have been about how individuals navigate morally treacherous situations. And in Beautiful Souls, I wrote about the resistors, the people who, in a sense, keep their hands clean by heeding the voice of conscience in various situations, sometimes risking their jobs, sometimes risking their lives. And as I was researching that book, I got more and more interested in people I was talking to and meeting on the way who actually did dirty their hands and who experienced these inner conflicts. And I could see the toll it had taken, both the toll on society at large, but also the toll on them. And those stories really stayed with me. I didn't write about them in that book, obviously, but I got really interested in telling their stories. And the more I thought about who is put in those situations, those morally conflicted situations, who does the dirty work in our society, the more this became a book about inequality, because my conclusion, or one of the messages of the book, is that it's very rarely the privileged and the powerful. It's more likely to be people at the bottom of the social ladder, people with fewer choices and opportunities, who are thrust into these ethically troubling roles that they carry out, in a sense, on society's behalf and in our name.
The easy assumption, right, would be that the people in the previous book, The Beautiful Souls, would be fundamentally different from the people who do the work that might be morally difficult or compromising. Is that actually the case? Are they different kinds of people? Are they better people, the ones who say, no, I won't do it, than the ones who do go along and do that work, often essential work?
I don't think of them as better or worse. I think that one of the messages of Beautiful Souls was that these were ordinary people who engaged in extraordinary acts. But that doesn't mean they're perfect people, and they're not. In this case, these are people who do things that are easy to condemn and deplore from a distance, but are very difficult to resist doing when you're the person doing it. Early in the book, I write about the mental health attendants, very poorly paid, very highly pressured, who work in jails and prisons. And jails and prisons are our nation's largest mental health institutions. And what happens to the frontline workers is they have two responsibilities. On the one hand, take care of your patients, make sure they get the mental health care they need. On the other hand, appease security. Don't cross security, because that could risk your own safety. And I tell the stories of a worker named Harriet Gryskovsky, who worked in a prison in Florida, who she gradually learns that the patients entrusted to her care are being abused, and severely abused. They're being starved, they're being put in solitary confinement. She eventually learns that some of them are being tortured in a shower with scalding water that is controlled from the outside. And Harriet doesn't say anything about this, just like all her peers on the staff didn't say anything. There was one person who did say something earlier before this. He was fired. And Harriet and the other people who I talked to, they didn't want to lose their jobs. They depended on these jobs for their livelihoods. So they stayed and they watched, and they were, in a sense, you could argue, accomplices to all of this. And yet I feel that we are all accomplices to what went on at that prison, because we shut down our state mental hospitals and defunded mental health care to such an extent that jails and prisons have, in a sense, filled in the gap. They're doing the dirty work for us that results in these deplorable abuses.
Let's pause for a moment on this situation in particular. There have been a few books in recent years about the way in which the mentally ill are quote unquote cared for by being incarcerated. But give us a little bit more background. This started during the Reagan era.
I would argue it started even earlier and with some good intentions. It's, the Kennedy administration, John F. Kennedy, started talking about shutting down these psychiatric hospitals and these asylums that were not really giving good care to the mentally ill. And there was a very well-intentioned movement to deinstitutionalize. But the premise of that movement was that there would be community services and community-based care. The funding for that never happened, and you're absolutely right. During the Reagan era, this movement ran into tax revolts and shrinking government. And so what you ended up having was mentally ill people, especially the poor, criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of mental illness, people sleeping on the streets, and often cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, which is the last place one would send someone in the throes of a psychiatric crisis to get care and treatment. And yet that's what we've done. So it's one example I go into in quite a bit of detail where I suggest that, this work has been structured by larger forces that puts people like Harriet, Krzyzewski, and others in really terrible situations.
How does someone like Harriet end up becoming a mental health care provider? I mean, what are the qualifications? Who are these jobs given to?
In that case, as in all the other cases in the book, these are, in a sense, jobs of last resort. Not for everyone, but if we look at the psychiatric profession, it's not elite psychiatrists who are working in corrections, who are working at the local jail and places like the Dade Correctional Institution. The pay isn't good, but even more than that, there's a stigma to it. You're working there? You can't get a better job, one that pays better. And yet there's also a very general recognition within the psychiatric and mental health profession that these are the people often most in need, the people cycling into jails, the people you see who are homeless and not getting services. So it's left to this solution that really isn't a solution and that results in both inhumane treatment of the mentally ill and a kind of dehumanizing conditions for the people on the front lines doing the work.
These jobs are, as you said, essential. You call them essential jobs. And after a year in which we've heard a lot of talk about essential workers, what do we mean by essential jobs? How does that differ from essential workers?
I use that term a little differently, but yeah, you're right. We've spent the past year and a half talking about and seeing how grocery clerks and delivery drivers perform these essential functions without which society could not function. And in particular, privileged people who stayed at home and were able to shelter in place. They got their groceries on time and all of that. I use essential workers a little differently. I'm talking about people who perform unpleasant tasks that are nevertheless necessary to the prevailing social order and the lifestyles many of us lead. There's a lot in the book about how dirty workers cater to the consumption choices of Americans, the food we eat, which is produced in an industrial agricultural system and in industrial slaughterhouses that very few of us want to see, and that indeed are hidden from our view for a purpose, for a reason. Or if we think of the fossil fuels we consumed, fracked and drilled in distant places, we're all using them, but we're not on the front lines doing the dirty work. And so the term essential is one that, some people would say, well, this isn't essential. We just shouldn't do these things. But if we peel back and look at what structures our society and what kinds of work we depend on, I think we find that it is more embedded in our world than we care to admit.
You said that these jobs are often a last resort for some or many of the employees. Can you give an example? Let's talk about slaughterhouse workers. Who ends up working on the floor in a slaughterhouse and why? I know you probably can't really generalize about all of them, but among the ones that you spoke with, how do they feel about the fact that this is what they're doing for a living?
This really came to a head during the pandemic. I mean, we had actually President Trump ordering slaughterhouses to continue running. Meat companies like Tyson and others said, consumers will be deprived of the supply of meat. Now, it turns out that's a very contestable claim. There were a lot of exports of meat to China during this period. But meanwhile, the quote-unquote essential workers on the front lines, who are they? They're often undocumented immigrants. They're poor. They're piecing together a living, and they're doing a job, the conditions of which have grown more and more dangerous physically, and I think more and more injurious to the spirit.
Why more dangerous physically?
One of the ways that the consumer demand for cheap meat is met is by speeding up lines so that you have fewer government inspectors and you have looser regulations, and you can literally run and kill and dismember more chickens, cows, pigs in these plants per minute than before. But there's someone doing the slicing and the cutting and the hauling and standing on those lines. And by and large, this has become work that immigrants do, many of them undocumented, that people of color disproportionately do. In the poultry industry, which I focus on in particular, it used to be a largely white workforce. After desegregation, many black workers started working in plants, and that actually caused some white workers to leave who didn't want to have black coworkers. And then gradually immigrants started coming in and often being brought in and recruited to work these jobs. One immigrant worker I spoke to joked with me, he worked in North Carolina. He said, yeah, every so often we'll see a white person come in to do the job for a day, and then they take their lunch break and they don't come back. And one of them joked to him, I'm not going to stand there and endure these brutal conditions day after day. So that's what I mean by work of last resort. In the particular chicken poultry plant I focused on, the worst thing about it was not even the repetitiveness and the physical strain that so many of the workers underwent. It was the fact that a largely female workforce was denied bathroom breaks in order to keep pace with the work. And so you literally had people going into work wearing an extra pair of pants and under that a sanitary napkin so that they could go to the bathroom on the line and not be reprimanded. No one who hears about that would condone it. And yet, as a society, we do condone it because it's very distant from us.
So that kind of work, slaughterhouse work, that sounds like dirty work to us. But what about something like dirty tech? What is that?
There are two kinds of dirty in the book, and they're not entirely different. It's not always one or the other, but sometimes the work involves literally contact with blood and with excrement, with animals, with things that evoke disgust. But there's work that is technically clean that can be very ethically troubling and morally troubling. And when I talk about dirty tech, in the last few years, we've had a sort of reckoning with how much of the technology and the machines that we rely on causes social harm in various forms, whether it's by circulating untrue stories and propaganda or through spyware. Very recently, the scandal of spyware being used and sold to governments by an Israeli company that used this to track dissidents and journalists. And so there is a lot of dirtiness in the tech world, and I do write about that. And, some of it takes place in very nice offices by people who are paid well for their work. Some of it takes place in the Congo, where cobalt is mined to power the batteries that run our iPhones and our smartphones and devices. But I do think that the tech workers, like any well-paid worker who does something that's ethically troubling, they're in a better position than people like the prison workers I write about or the slaughterhouse workers I write about. They're not as stuck in what they do. That's one reason for that. And another is that they're doing a job that is not as devalued and stigmatized in our society. So even though we've had this reckoning with some of the troubling things that technology causes, it's still a very prestigious thing to be a software engineer. This is a book where I'm talking about injuries like stigma and shame, and I do think that class and status shapes how those things play out.
Did those workers in tech, where they did have a little bit more choice, a little more movement, did they feel ethically troubled by what they were doing? Did they feel like they were victims of moral injury?
I spoke in depth to two former Google employees, both of whom discovered as they were working at Google that they were working on programs that troubled them. In one case, it was a search engine that Jack Paulson, a former Google employee, discovered was going to be used in China, but the Chinese government was going to censor certain search terms and potentially use it to track dissidents, as is being done in China. He was horrified by this. I do think he might have suffered from moral injury or some kind of deep, lasting ethical wound if he'd stayed on, but he left. And that's one of the things that can help a person in such a situation is to exit, and essentially to leave the company and to do something else. And people with high-tech skills can do that more easily than undocumented immigrants in a slaughterhouse. That's pretty clear. But that said, I also interviewed another former Google employee, Laura Nolan, who found out that she was working on something that was tangentially related, potentially directly related to helping drone strikes be carried out. And Nolan, who is Irish, wanted nothing to do with this. And when she found out, she stopped sleeping well. She felt stressed out. She pretty much told me that she felt this guilt and gloom overtake her, and she eventually left. But her experience does suggest that it's perfectly possible for someone in a situation like that to bring home a nice paycheck and seem to be doing fine, but actually be deeply troubled.
it's probably an indictment, or surely an indictment of our society and our economy and our government, that there are so many jobs you could have written about for this book. In your view, are we all complicit in this work?
We are. I do say at various points in the book, I want to make it very clear, I'm not saying this work is immutable and unchangeable and is some sort of structural force that nothing can alter. And I talk here and there about the people who want to shed light on it, the protesters who show up at prisons or drone bases to alert society and to say, hey, we can't allow this to go on. But I also think that in the case of what those protesters and what the revelations sometimes lead to is a kind of piling on the lowest ranking people who foot the blame. So it becomes a story about bad apples, much in the way that Abu Ghraib did, right? We all remember kind of Charles Garner, Lindy England. Oh, they took those photos. What a horror. But no senior officials were prosecuted for that. And as a society, I don't know that we reckon fully with what torture means, because torture takes place in the jails and prisons of the United States. And we have solitary confinement on a scale that doesn't exist in so many other countries. So the reckoning is incomplete. And I think part of the reason the reckoning is incomplete is that this work is well hidden from us, and it's easy to avert our eyes.
So on the one hand, we could protest, we could blame and condemn certain individuals for being responsible for some of the worst acts that take place in some of this dirty work. On the other end, we know that these jobs are, as you said, essential. Someone has to do it. It has to get done. What do you think could be done to make the lives of these workers perhaps better, assuming that the jobs can't be eliminated altogether?
I'm not a policy expert, and I'm not an advocate. So the book is a set of stories, and I think that, my hope is that it enables us to see this work and the people who do it more clearly and in a more humane light, which is both about what this costs us when people suffer because of this work, but also what happens when we don't actually reckon with it and just blame the people doing it. There isn't a set of policy prescriptions that I lay out. What I do say is that because we've become such an unequal society, I think it's no surprise that dirty work is organized and delegated unequally. So that even if you look at the geography of dirty work, where do industrial slaughterhouses and prisons generally get built? They're in remote, poorer areas. They're not in upscale, nice communities because they're stigmatized institutions and people don't want to be reminded of them. And so I think that the first thing we need to do is see that this work is part of our society and that we have allowed it and tolerated it for it to go on as long as we have. Here and there, I do sort of suggest that there are ways where if we made the allocation more random, we might rethink it. So, for example, I'm not a proponent of expanding America's military footprint by any means, but I do think we should think about having a draft if we're going to have never-ending wars, because without a draft, what I think we end up doing is relying on a certain part of the population, the other 1%, I call it in the book, to fight our wars, and then not to think about it, and then to condemn it when we hear about something terrible, but not really to engage whether this is something as a society we need to rethink.
Right, not to own it.
Exactly.
Let's end with the words of one of the people you interviewed, describing their own work and the way that they feel about it. You can choose among any of the people you interviewed.
Sure. So I'm going to choose Bill Curtis. So after I tell the stories of the mental health attendants at the Dade Correctional Institution, anyone who reads that part of the book is going to think, well, there's an obvious villain to this story, and it's the security guards. They did these horrible things. They deserve condemnation, and they should be prosecuted for their crimes. And I by no means suggest the guards who were involved in this abuse shouldn't be held accountable. Of course they should be. But the chapter that follows is about corrections officers in Florida and the kinds of conditions they work under. And one of the corrections officers I write about is Bill Curtis, who is now retired, but who told me, when a man, a good man, or a woman goes into prison, a little bit of your goodness wears off. You become jaded. You become more callous. He sort of described this moral slide that happens and just sort of said it and then put his eyes down. And in the course of talking, he also shared excerpts from a diary he'd kept while he worked that sort of alluded to moments where he witnessed and maybe experienced this moral slide. And I think what stayed with me with that is that, of course, there are corrections officers who mete out abuse without thinking about it very long. They sleep well at night. And in fact, Curtis told me as much. He said, he called them serial bullies. But then he went on to say, in Florida, we get what we pay for here. We have the third largest prison system in the country. We pay the people who work in it very little. We have very little in the way of rehabilitative programs. And how does an officer learn to enforce order in such a situation? Simple, brute force. You intimidate and you go to war, in essentially. And Curtis, by the way, is a military veteran, as many corrections officers are. And then you sort of look at the levels of suicide and trauma, and I would argue moral injury among people who work in prisons. And it starts to become a much more complicated story, in which the easy villains in the story turn out to be more complicated. And maybe some of the blame should be spread around to a state that spends so little. Florida's among the last in per capita spending on mental health. And so many of the people, and again, Curtis talked about this in his diary, he had no training to deal with people with mental illnesses, and yet that's what he was often encountered with. So if we look past just the labels and go into the institutional settings and the bigger constraints, then I think we come away with a much more nuanced understanding of what the real problem with dirty work is.
I think you've made it clear why this is such a humane and empathetic book. Eyal, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Eyal Press's new book is called Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America.
This is John Williams, and Alexandra Alter joins me now for news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, John. So would you like some good news?
That was quick. I'm happy to get good news.
So as we've talked about on the podcast regularly, the pandemic was a real concern for the industry when it occurred first, now in what seems like forever ago. And as it has dragged on, the industry has proved to be incredibly resilient. Book sales are actually doing great in all formats: print, audio, ebooks. And so some recent numbers that came in from NPD Bookscan showed that so far this year in 2021, in the first 6 months of the year, sales rose 18% in the first half of the year. So I think probably because we're comparing it to 2020, the first few months of the spring when the pandemic first hit and bookstores were closed and supply chains were really disrupted, sales did fall. But then they really resurged. And particularly over the summer of last year, sales were enormous. Part of it was in June, a lot of readers were turning to books about race and racism. Also in the summer, there was this huge wave of Trump tell-alls, Mary Trump's book, John Bolton. So those really boosted the numbers. And then going into the election, there was a lot of interest in political books. And so it ended up being a really good year for publishers. But what we've seen is that people are still turning to books now, even though there's more movement, people can travel, there's not a hard lockdown anywhere or quarantine. Some publishers were worried that once people were able to go about their lives in a more regular fashion, that this urge to curl up with a book and escape might leave people. But it turns out so far, people are still reading quite a bit. We've seen a resurgence of fiction sales, adult fiction is back, nonfiction is holding pretty steady too. So
that's great. And am I right to say, speaking of nonfiction, that we're still in a Trump-influenced reading cycle?
Yes, very interesting, because I think, as I talked about on the podcast before, publishers really thought once we had a change in administration, we might not have the same level of interest in political books. And there was a pretty substantial dip at the start of the new Biden administration. What they'd called the Trump bump certainly tapered off a bit, which was certainly expected. Not only was Trump no longer in office and generating headlines and generating cable news coverage, but you often see after an election year when interest is sky high in politics, you often see a dip the following year. It's not a midterm election year, it's not a presidential election year. But even though there was that dip in the first half of this year, there's a bunch of political titles that are taking off right now. So if you look at the top of the nonfiction bestseller list, it's crammed with these titles. There's new books about the Trump administration, looking at his last year in office with some explosive news. And some of those have actually sold almost as well as you would expect when he was in office. For example, I Alone Can Fix It, which is an account by the Washington Post reporters Carol Leonnig and Philip Rucker, has sold better than their book that came out when he was in office, which was surprising.
And that second book covers his administration's response to the pandemic primarily.
Yes, and it also gets into his final months in office and his dispute of the election results and his efforts to overturn the results of the election. So there's a lot of new information about what went on in the White House during that period. The other book that popped up on the bestseller list is by U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexandra Vindman, who was a key figure in the impeachment of President Trump, his first impeachment over the Ukraine. So he has a book out now called Here, Right Matters, and that's selling very well.
How often does Bookscan release these numbers? Is it every 6 months, every quarter?
Bookscan has weekly reports, and then they will do monthly reports as well. And they also slice and dice things based on genre. So they track the sale of political books, and they did see that in the first 7 months of this year, sales for political books fell by 18% compared to 2020. But even though they've fallen, political book sales are still well above their 2016 level and their 2019 level. So what publishers have seen is that all these new readers that were drawn into the genre, perhaps because of Donald Trump or just because of political polarization during his time in office, many of them have stuck around. So even though you don't have these blockbusters by Mary Trump or John Bolton, you still have people who may be looking for more.
I think Mary Trump has another book coming out later this year.
Yes, that's right. Mary Trump has another book coming out. So do a few other authors who really capitalized on interest in Trump. For example, Michael Wolff just had a book out. Bob Woodward has one coming. So we're seeing some sequels and even trilogies, I think, are coming.
It's like the Marvel universe of Trump books. Well, it'll be interesting to talk to you later in the year because obviously, as you said, last year's second half was especially strong. So it'll be interesting to see how it compares and contrasts with this year.
Yes. And I think another question for the fall, because there's so many big novels coming out this fall, literary novels and commercial fiction, that I think there's going to be extremely high interest in. There's questions again about supply chain. If you remember, during the pandemic, it was an issue. But even before that, publishers tried to get the infrastructure just right so that they can resupply bookstores right when stuff runs out. They're not printing as many copies as they used to because they don't want to take those returns if the books don't sell or store them in warehouses. But sometimes as a result, books sell out and they can't reprint them fast enough.
Well, much to monitor in the coming months. And luckily, we have you on all the time, so we'll talk about it.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, John.
Our critics Jennifer Szalai and Dwight Garner join us now to talk about the latest in literary criticism. Hey there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Jen, let's start with you. What did you write about this week?
So I reviewed a book recently. It's called Reign of Terror. And the author is Spencer Ackerman, who is a longtime national security reporter for various publications, including The New Republic, Wired, The Guardian. And this is a book that presents what I sometimes call a blunt force thesis, which I feel like sometimes makes a book maybe sound more simplistic than it actually is. And this, I should preface this by saying this is a very good book. And the subtitle is How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He makes very clear that this isn't a monocausal argument. He's basically saying, and he's showing, he takes us through chronologically the past 20 years. And he shows us how not only did the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq on the War of Terror, not only did they destabilize the Middle East, but they also destabilized things at home. And essentially how they did this is by fighting wars where it wasn't really clear what victory or peace would really look like or entail. So what that meant was that it constantly had to tap into this vague sense of civilizational conflict and existential threat. He also makes clear that presidents at various points have tried to say, well, we're not fighting a war against Muslims. I mean, George Bush said this at some points, but at the same time, Bush also called it a crusade against terror. And so what this did was tap into a longstanding strain of nativist sentiment in the US that, coupled with long, prolonged national humiliation, really made it easy for somebody like Trump to seize and essentially experience this totally unexpected at the time political rise. I should say that, the book is really well written. As I said, even if it's a blunt force thesis, he's very good, I think, showing step by step, taking us through time, showing exactly how these things happened and how they connect in a way that doesn't feel overdetermined. And I was really impressed by the book. And I think even people who don't necessarily come to the same conclusion as Ackerman will find it really illuminating.
So we're coming upon the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I imagine this is one of many books that have crossed your desk, Jen, that are re-examining either the event itself, the events leading up to the attacks of 9/11, or the subsequent wars and foreign policy, domestic policy related to 9/11 since. Are you getting a lot of those books? And how do you decide which ones to read and review?
There are a number of books, although because 9/11 was such a transformative event in the American experience that, we've had books about it almost from the very beginning, nonfiction books describing the decision-making about how America responded, describing the path that led to the attacks in terms of what was going on in Afghanistan. And in terms of deciding what to review, what I'm really interested in looking at now, I think, are books that really take into account the full scope of what's happened in the last 20 years. And I think that this is part of the reason why I found this book really interesting. He doesn't just respond to the 9/11 attacks and how the US responded, but he takes into account how different administrations responded. He looks very closely at, for example, how the Obama administration responded. And Barack Obama, if we'll recall, was somebody who was very much, at least when he was campaigning, had presented himself as somebody who was against the forever wars. But then once he got into office, as Ackerman shows, Obama was really somebody who decided to put them on what he called a more sustainable footing. The war on terror would be something that was more sustainable, and so something that would be managed in such a way. And I think one of the things that Ackerman shows is that the centrist establishments of both parties thought that the American response and the forever wars were something that could be managed, that could be done in such a way that wouldn't necessarily have much political blowback. And what he shows is that that wasn't the case.
All right, this is a kind of big and general question, but I'm curious. What was the best 9/11 related nonfiction book that you'd read up until this point, at least? Did you read The Looming Tower?
Yes. I think Lawrence Wright, he's somebody who, and he recently wrote a book about the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic. I mean, he's somebody who, in terms of giving a narrative account, that's definitely one of the books that are up there. The thing about 9/11 and the way that it has transformed not only the world, but also the United States itself, I think is this ongoing question. And so it is fascinating to see how writers at different points have handled that. Because I think, before 2016, I mean, nobody, or at least not very many people necessarily thought that Trump, who at that point was known as the host of The Apprentice, would be president. Before 2020, we wouldn't necessarily have known that we're living through a pandemic. The way that writers not only respond to the moment and the way the moment has changed, but also try to incorporate the long history to that becomes an increasingly interesting question for me, especially when it comes to this subject.
It's odd for me. I almost have the opposite reaction. I find that I'm drawn to the books that home in very closely to the events of the day. Like the TikToks, like 102 Minutes or The Only Plane in the Sky. And I think it's maybe because we were all kind of there but not there, even as it was going on. You had such a narrow sense of what you were actually seeing. I don't know if you read Jen Senior's piece in The Atlantic.
I haven't read that yet. I'm saving it, but I've heard very good things about it.
It's so good. And I think one of the things she makes clear at some point in the piece is that everyone was left without a sense of what actually happened during those final moments. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what that was like for those who were there. And it's that kind of that mystery and that absence that I think in a strange way, maybe many of us are trying to fill in to just somehow get a grasp on it.
Oh, sure. No, I think that that's definitely the case. Just one more thing about this Ackerman book is that he's very clear, in terms of the actual trauma that people experienced on September 11th, the death, the devastation, the shock about what happened. I mean, that's real. I feel like I've read some critical accounts of the war on terror that almost try to downplay that, and he doesn't do that, thankfully. But he also says that when it comes to the reaction of the most powerful military in the world, that obviously the trauma was real and that's important to think about. But at the same time, what it did was that it led to these throwing things at what happened and lashing out in a way that didn't necessarily think very clearly about, okay, when will this be over? How will we consider it over? What are the things that we are willing to do and not do in order to fight this war on terror? And so he goes through, for example, the issue of torture. That's why I'm also interested in these books, because I do think that we all have our own personal experiences of September 11th, which I think are really important to share. But I also feel like he really contextualizes it in a way that I think is really necessary. I mean, I think, we've had 20 years of forever wars. And this is something that he asks us to ask of ourselves. Okay, well, what is it that we're willing to countenance? What is it that we're willing to tolerate? And what does an end game look like to the United States? So, Dwight, tell us what you reviewed recently.
I reviewed Rita Dove's new book of poems, and it's called Playlist for the Apocalypse. Rita Dove, she's our former poet laureate, or PLOTUS, as I like to say. And, she's won the Pulitzer Prize. Her book of collected poems, which came out in 2004, is just one of my favorite books of poetry written in the last 25 years. But her new one, it's a sad book in some ways, because she announces in it that she has had multiple sclerosis for about 2 decades now. And so some of the poems are about that. But they're still about joy, and she's always been a big dancer in her poems, and she's still writing about things. Her MS is intermittent, she writes, which has been a good thing for her. The poems are just so literate about American history. They're about food. They're about being alive, and this great mix of high and low in her work that really appeals to me.
And does she talk about still dancing? Isn't that something that helped her with her MS?
It helped her a bit. I'm not sure she can do it any longer, but it's always been a metaphor in her work. It's one of her sort of typical things that she talks about. She calls America this blistered, shining republic. Some of them are right on the news. I mean, she writes about Black Lives Matter, and she writes about other recent topics in American history, but she has this great long sense of that history as well.
Dwight, you also mentioned in your review that the title of it was something that jumped out to you.
Well, it's a pretty great title, don't you think? I mean, Playlist for the Apocalypse.
Yes.
I mean, it's one of those titles that jumps into your arms. And when I first saw it, I worried for a second. I worried that it's a really good title, but it's also a slightly glib title. I worried that she would just be riffing on the news, and it's not that at all. She has poems about a lot of the major civil rights figures. She has poems set in the 1940s. One is called Girls on the Town, 1946, and one is called Elevator Man, 1949. She sort of shuffles back and forth through history and ends up in the present. It actually welled me up at the end, and I actually wrote her publisher to make sure that she was okay, because some of the poems at the end are quite dark. And she is okay, I'm glad to say. And the book itself overall isn't an utterly dark book, but there's this weight of not just history, but of mortality hanging over this book, and I think it's quite beautiful.
All right, let's run down the titles of the books that you each wrote about again. Jen?
So I reviewed Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump by Spencer Ackerman.
And I reviewed Playlist for the Apocalypse, poems by Rita Dove.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, Not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.